So thank you very much. Good afternoon for us, or good morning for others, good evening. I am Anna Albazzi del Frate. I am the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. A very warm welcome to our parallel event on gender gaps in cybersecurity. I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Alliance. We are the umbrella organization supporting the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program, including the UN Crime Commission and the crime treaties. We are pleased to join forces today with the Vienna Committee on the Status of Women and the Vienna Committee on Sustainable Development, both represented here by Ingeborg Geyer. Thank you very much, Inge, for being with us. In organizing this event that will discuss how cybersecurity failures have become a reflection of offline patterns of abuse, exclusion, and discrimination, often magnified when women and girls enter the online space. Our panelists will report on the progress of gender mainstreaming in the elaboration of a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes, currently being negotiated in Vienna and New York by an ad hoc committee. The first speaker who will actually bring us into this area is Isabella Wilkinson, a research associate in the International Security Program at Chatham House and part of the editorial team for the Journal of Cyber Policy. Isabella, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning all. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. I'm certainly excited about this conversation and really looking forward to hearing from our other panelists and our esteemed colleagues in the Q&A afterwards. Before I start my intervention, I'd just like to apologize. I have two bright lights shining at me, and for some reason, it is not picking up my Zoom video. And so if my video goes incredibly dark and you can't see me, let me know, and I'll try to adjust my Zoom settings for low light again, because right now I think I'm just a floating head. But again, just by way of personal introduction, as Anna mentioned, I am part of Chatham House's cyber policy team. I also have the privilege of sitting on the editorial team for the Journal of Cyber Policy. And a huge focus of my team's work increasingly are gender transformative and inclusive approaches to cyberspace, whether this manifests in making sure countries have the tools they need for cybersecurity capacity building, whether this manifests in making sure that gender equality and gender mainstreaming are priorities in cyber diplomacy and international cyber governance initiatives around the world, or whether this is applying a gendered lens to cyber conflict and geopolitical contestation on the international stage and how that plays out specifically in cyberspace. So around International Women's Day, in case you can't tell, I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking about obviously my primary research interest, but of course, the timing of it makes it that much better. In my intervention, and I'll probably take around 15 to 20 minutes, I'd like to, as Anna mentioned, provide a little bit of a lay of the land. I'll start by addressing the key question, what is a gender gap in cyber and how are we approaching it, I suppose, as a team at Chatham House, and how might this be different from the way that the audience and different panelists are approaching it, recognizing, of course, that gender means different things in different places. So after explaining my approach and my team's approach to gender gaps in cyber, I'll be moving on to be providing an update on the state of discussions on gender mainstreaming and gender equality in the UN ad hoc committee process to develop a convention on cybercrime. And I'll conclude my talk by looking into the risks of failing to incorporate at this stage and sufficiently a gender equality perspective in this UN process. But along with each risk, because I'm at heart an optimist, I'll also be providing some opportunities for overcoming this difficulty and really building better for the future for gender equality in fighting cybercrime, of course, but in international cyber governance more generally. I believe I'm in panelist mode, and so if there are any questions that come up in the chat or any Q&As, I'm happy to take these live. I'm also happy to take them in the designated Q&A section towards the end of the talk. And of course, if I'm speaking too quickly or if there's any issues with my video or audio, do let me know and I will circle back around. Great, so just to...
So far so good. You are perfectly on screen, and maybe just a little bit slower. If you speak a bit slower, it would be perfect. Thank you.
For sure. Sorry about that. I will try my best to speak a little bit slower. So as I mentioned, the first part of my talk is going to focus on what are gender gaps in cyber. And I think before we tackle this question, we need to ask ourselves, why does gender matter in cyber in the first place? Because I think for us, for our panel, for the attendees, this is kind of an obvious question. You know, we're all here because we are convinced that gender has an important role to play in communications and, you know, conversations around cybersecurity. However, I think for a lot of people, whether they're policy practitioners, whether they're just a general audience, this link isn't clear and it isn't obvious. And so I really want to dig into this to make sure we're all starting from the same point. My team and I encounter a kind of core set of common myths when it comes to explaining why gender and cyber are interlinked. One of these myths is that gender and women's issues are synonymous. And so when we're talking about gender in cyber, it only means we're talking about women's issues in cyberspace, which is 100% not the case. When we talk about gender and cyber, we're inclusive of a diversity of different gender identities and really need to put an intersectional approach front and center, which I'll go into later when I speak about the Cybercrime Convention itself. The second myth that we often encounter is, well, you know, gender and cyber. Why are we talking about this? Because cyber is a technical issue, it's not a social issue. How can we talk about these two things in the same vein? Again, to debunk this myth, we need to approach cyber and cyber policy as a social issue, not just a technical issue. Cyberspace often reflects the bias, discrimination, and power hierarchies that exist offline. They can mirror them, they can amplify them, but they certainly do get transformed and they don't go away. And the third myth that we often encounter when we're, you know, speaking about why gender is important in cyber is that gender equality shouldn't be a cyber policy priority. And I think this draws on a somewhat traditional mindset that cyber is, again, a technical issue and it's not a social issue. And I think it's really important right off the bat to recognize that gender diversity or conversations on gender diversity, conversations on gender equality, and conversations on gender mainstreaming have a core cybersecurity element and vice versa. Again, I'll go into why, you know, these myths have been debunked and are continuing to be debunked in the context of the UN Cybercrime Convention. But I thought it might be a valuable starting point to get us all on the same page. So, okay, so we've answered, you know, why is gender important in cyber, or at least we've kind of answered, you know, some of these common myths around it, right? Or maybe we're just trying to get there. The next question I think we should tackle is, why is gender specifically important in cybersecurity, or maybe cyber policy more broadly? Put simply, more inclusive policies made by a group that's more representative and reflective of the communities they serve are better policies. And gender diversity at all stages of policy design, development, implementation, review is key. I think that we can understand why this is important by splitting our thinking into two categories, right? We understand that different genders experience cyberspace in different ways. Different genders may experience different risks and harms in cyberspace, but at the same time, they might experience different opportunities brought by cyberspace digital development. And so understanding that different genders have different harms, vulnerabilities, risks, opportunities in cyberspace is absolutely key to realizing that policies themselves need to be designed with this kind of gender differential process in gender differential assumption in mind, baked in as opposed to taken from the margins after the fact, which I think is probably a key narrative and conversation, particularly around this conference where, you know, people agree gender is important, but a lot of the time policymakers try to reverse engineer it into policy as opposed to making it a policy priority from the get-go. So reflecting on these questions, why is gender important in cyber? What are some common myths? How can we define a gender gap? In cyber, or really in any field, I would define a gender gap as a bridge that needs to be built between existing knowledge and assumptions and the gendered realities and the gendered future of a certain field or domain. So in cyber policy, closing the gender gap is a matter of gender mainstreaming across our policies, from design and development, implementation to review. And I'm excited personally, particularly around International Women's Day, to see that closing the gender gap in cybersecurity is a discussion that in itself has been mainstreamed at the international level. So UN cyber processes like the open-ended working group do mention gender quite regularly. The new head of the International Telecommunications Union, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, has declared that gender equality and gender mainstreaming are a key priority for her, and there's been really important steps taken at the international level. Nationally speaking, more and more cybersecurity strategies are recognizing that closing the gender gap, whether this is closing the gender digital divide or encouraging more diverse gendered identities to get into cyber as a career, is a priority. So I think that summarizes the first part of my talk on, how I would approach a gender gap in cybersecurity or just cyber more generally. I think as a caveat as well, throughout this talk, I know that the title of the conversation is Gender Gaps in Cybersecurity. I'm going on to talk about cybercrime. You'll hear me talk about cyber policy. Of course, these all carry different meanings, and it's really important to understand the overlaps. So I'm happy to share some literature on that as well. But that's just in case there's any cyber policy folks in the audience thinking, hang on, we need to make sure we're somewhat coherent with our definitions here. And again, the terminology we use, cybersecurity, cybercrime, cyber policy, do have different gendered implications, but I can go into that later as well. So as I mentioned, the second part of my talk is going to be looking a little bit at the status of discussions on gender mainstreaming in the UN Ad Hoc Committee. I'm not sure whether anyone can use the chat function or whether anyone can use the raise hand function, but I would really love to get an impression from the audience, the level of underlying knowledge about what the UN Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime is and its purpose. Maybe anyone could throw it into the chat or into the Q&A as I'm speaking, just so that I can know to add an extra layer of detail as I go along. So in any case, the UN Ad Hoc Committee on Countering the Criminal Misuse of Information and Communications Technologies, often shortened to the AHC on Cybercrime, is a new international process that falls within the UN's third committee, tasked with creating an internationally binding treaty on combating cybercrime. I'll share some links in the chat to describing kind of the history and the evolution of the AHC later, so that I save some time for the rest of my talk as well. However, it was the result of a proposal by Russia in 2019 to establish the AHC. It met, I believe, in early 2022 for its first meeting after an organizational session. The reason I'm stumbling over my words is even though this process was kickstarted in 2019, COVID posed a significant amount of uncertainty and delay in the structure, timeline, and kind of the roadmap of the AHC. And so after a little bit of a messy start, it has its first negotiating session in January 2022. That's one of 6, when states are invited to Vienna and New York to discuss the chapters, the structure, and the content of the future convention. Again, aiming to be an international instrument designed to combat cybercrime. As I'm sure you can imagine, cybercrime means different things for different countries, and different countries are very much bringing different priorities and approaches to the table. And there's a significant level of contestation over anything from the use of terms to the scope and objectives of the future treaty. This treaty will include everything from provisions on criminalization, general provisions setting out the objectives of the treaty and kind of what it covers, procedural measures and instructions for how law enforcement across borders should cooperate with each other, provisions on international cooperation, mechanisms for implementation, review, final provisions, and of course on technical assistance and capacity building. But among all of this very interesting content, what I want to focus on is the status of gender equality within this Cybercrime Convention process. So as I mentioned, there are 6 sessions. It's on track to have a final draft treaty ahead of, I believe, August or September this year, with a view to getting it passed through the UNGA. So we've just come out of the 4th session, which ended in January. Member states received a consolidated negotiating document, which for the first time was the chair's effort to bring together different state proposals and say, this is a framework for negotiation. And within this consolidated negotiating document, and within Article 5 on the protection of human rights, gender mainstreaming and gender equality got its own shout out. So I want to, at this point, dig into different member state approaches to the inclusion of gender mainstreaming within the convention text. However, I thought I would maybe pause just for 10-15 seconds to see if anyone has any questions at this point, if I'm going too quickly, or if there's anything about the AHC, which in itself is a very complex process that I might have glazed over.
Isabella, I would recommend that you continue and we collect all the questions at the end. Please write in the Q&A, write in the chat, don't hesitate. And we will collect, for the sake of time, the questions at the end. Thank you.
Sounds good, sounds good. So I'll keep going. I'm just aware often with ad hoc committee related things, it's an avalanche of information. And so I'm always keen to break for questions, but again, we can circle back around. So as I mentioned right now, I want to focus on different member state approaches on whether or whether not to include gender mainstreaming in the convention, and then think about the consequences of doing so or failing to do so. As I'm sure many of our esteemed audience are aware, conversations on gender mainstreaming are often looped into conversations on the protection of human rights or the protection of vulnerable groups or maybe victims of cybercrime. This is really valuable on the one hand, because it allows us to benefit from shared momentum of conversations on these issues and almost package different issues together to ensure that they gain consensus. However, gender mainstreaming and gender equality is a distinct area with its own specific consequences when it comes to mainstreaming it across international responses to fight cybercrime. And so it does deserve its own conversation. As I mentioned before, gender mainstreaming, the importance of gender mainstreaming does get its own shout out in Article 5.2 of the AHC's current consolidated negotiating document. Now, the language itself is quite contested. I'll put a link into the chat of the chair's current consolidated negotiating document, which I believe shows maybe 5, 10, 15 different versions of the same article proposed by different states. Some states, like the UK and Canada, are key advocates of pushing for gender equality and gender mainstreaming in the convention. They want to make sure it's distinct from protections for vulnerable groups, but they really want to up there in the general provisions. Other states, like Singapore and Jamaica, acting on behalf of CARICOM, are interested either in gender mainstreaming where appropriate, or they're not convinced yet of the kind of operationalizable value of gender mainstreaming across the convention, so they're yet to be determined. So that's the kind of second camp. And then finally, there are a group of member states who in the past negotiating session have made it very, very clear that gender mainstreaming and issues of gender equality are outside of the scope of the convention, and they don't have value to add to the Cybercrime Treaty as it stands. So you can see the emergence of these kind of 3 general groups of states. A lot of the time, it does mimic some groupings when it comes to human rights and the value of human rights protections throughout the convention, which I'll get to later. But I did just want to kind of give you, oh, excuse me, that's our work fire alarm going off, but it should knock off in a second. So the final kind of, the final almost lay of the land I'd like to give you when it comes to gender mainstreaming across the ad hoc committee's convention negotiating process, I think returns to one of our earlier questions on, well, why is it important to have conversations about gender gaps in cyber? why is gender mainstreaming so important in cybercrime policymaking in the first place? Again, I think for much of our panel and much of our audience, this is an issue that's a little bit of a given. However, I think it's important to kind of return to those basic questions and use them to kind of build back for the future, build ahead for the future, particularly when it comes to creating a strong framework and a strong foundation for conversations on the value of gender mainstreaming, really the practical value for convention negotiating processes, for example. So one of my colleagues, a senior research fellow from the cyber policy team, recently co-authored a paper on gender mainstreaming, specifically this cybercrime convention, with article by article recommendations for how the consolidated negotiating draft could have stronger commitments to gender equality. It applies, and maybe this is a given, to all aspects of the future convention, from the negotiations to the substantive and procedural provisions, and to its implementation and oversight mechanisms as well. I mean, as we know, cybercrime and responses to cybercrime and the impact of cybercrime with norms, regulation, law is anything but gender neutral. We need to take concrete steps to consider the different risks and vulnerabilities faced by different groups when designing cybercrime policy. To kind of hark back to my point from earlier, we need to make sure they are effective and make sure that these policies are not, we need to make sure that these policies have sufficient safeguards to ensure they're not used to target, for example, human rights activists or dissidents. As we know, different genders have different experiences of cyberspace, and the same applies for cybercrime, whether this is referring to different gendered experience of cyber-dependent crimes or cyber-enabled crimes, which I can go into later as well. Just being aware of time, I might save explanation for that
yes,
later.
You don't have much time left.
So okay, great. It's great. Can I maybe wrap up my remarks in about 2 minutes?
Oh yes, even more. You have even 3 or 4.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. So as I mentioned, different genders have different experiences of cybercrime. This is why it's so key to gender mainstream our approach to cybercrime policymaking. Online gender-based violence would be the obvious example. Hack and leak, cyber attacks and hack and leak crimes of personal information from large databases also have specific gendered and sexualized risks. Surveillance and spyware technology, the impact of these cybercrimes, again, is different for all different genders. I mean, I think it's important here to make sure that we're not synonymizing gender with women, because at the same time, men and boys will have very, very different experiences and vulnerabilities to different cybercrime than women, girls, people that are non-binary, gender non-conforming, etc., etc. Different genders also have different experiences of the way that cybercrime is investigated, for example, referring to procedural measures. And I will probably leave it to the rest of the panel to go into that with a much more direct experience in this area than I do. But I think the key takeaway here is that gender mainstreaming, cybercrime is at its core in many ways a gender equality issue, and fighting cybercrime specifically. Gender mainstreaming, the future cybercrime convention, is a strategic priority on a variety of different levels, and a good, sufficient future cybercrime convention will need to take into consideration the gender element of each of its chapters. I know I've only gone in to speak about criminalization and procedural measures, but there are risks inherent of failing to do so. So I'm aware I might be running out of time, but the final part of my talk, as I mentioned, will look at the risks of failing to incorporate a gender perspective in the AHC negotiations and in the future cybercrime convention. I'd like to kind of preface this part of my talk by saying that commitments and words are different to action itself. And so we need to keep this in mind throughout, recognizing the importance of posturing, of, commitments in writing, but also recognizing the need to operationalize it. And I think in any conversations on international commitments to gender equality, we do need to put this front and center, the difference between words and action. So I'm going to look at these risks by looking at different chapters that will be included in the future convention, the risks of failing to integrate a gender equality and gender mainstreaming perspective, and looking at the opportunities of building this convention with gender equality within these specific chapters and kind of what that could bring. In the criminalization chapter, a commitment to gender equality within Article 5.2, as I mentioned before, would encourage member states to really consider the gender dimension of different criminalized acts, whether these are cyber-enabled acts or cyber-dependent, and failing to do so can be dangerous because the impact, because all crimes currently, included in the draft convention text have a gendered element, as we went into before. And I look forward to returning to more of these examples in the Q&A. For example, one of the articles within the current criminalization chapter is on sextortion. Having a commitment to gender equality and a commitment to gender mainstreaming earlier on in the convention is so important because it infuses this article. It means that when it's implemented, a gender perspective, ideally, is kept in mind, given that different genders are impacted by sextortion in different ways. I won't go into procedural measures in the interest of time, neither will I go into capacity building and technical assistance, but I think suffice to say that gender mainstreaming brings extreme benefits to these chapters as well. But I do want to kind of close my remarks by looking at the risks of failing to incorporate gender mainstreaming in the implementation and review of the future treaty itself, given that it does get passed in the UNGA. Strong reference to gender equality and gender mainstreaming, I believe, would help hold member states to account in the future. It allows, or maybe creates, a foundation for the future for member states to consider the gendered elements of the treaty at its different points in its life cycle. Not doing so completely risks overlooking the role that gender plays, I guess, in the negotiations, in the drafting, in the document, in the implementation and review phases itself. I think that this is important as a symbolic action because, as I mentioned, it might lay a foundation as a precedent for further gender mainstreaming in other UN or international multilateral cyber processes. I think here it returns to an earlier theme in my talk, which is the importance of opening the door and building this kind of fertile foundation for meaningful change, committing to, for example, do a gender audit of the future treaty or appointing gender advisors. As I mentioned, many of these recommendations are the result of a paper authored by a researcher on my team, Dr. James Shires, a senior research fellow in cyber policy here at Chatham House, and Dr. Catherine Miller, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. It's a really wonderful paper, great recommendations, and it's really inspired a lot of my work today, so I'll make sure to put the link to that in the chat. I will probably conclude here, if that's okay, but just to summarize, of course, international cybercrime policymaking is a gender equality issue. Gender mainstreaming brings to the floor a range of different benefits for improving the inclusivity and effectiveness of international cybercrime policymaking, particularly at the ad hoc committee, but in other venues as well. Today, I addressed, the approach to defining gender gaps in cyber. I then gave an overview of the state of discussions around gender mainstreaming in the UN ad hoc committee, of course, recognizing that there's much more nuance and disagreement on the day-to-day level. I'm happy to go into some more of those details in the Q&A. And then finally, I looked at some of the risks and opportunities inherent in this space. So thank you very much for the floor. I'll hand it back over to Anna.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Thank you, because you also summarized your own presentation, so I don't have to repeat the summary. But I would like to add the emphasis that you placed on something that is very important, that is the gender considerations in the negotiations of an international treaty that can be a model for future engagement. These negotiations also represent a good practice in the UN, also because of the involvement of the multi-stakeholders. So a very good example of engaging civil society, academia and private sector. And we hope that this will also result in better and stronger consideration of gender issues overall. So thank you very much, Isabella. We will now get into concrete examples, I think, with the second speaker, Alison Yakabe, who is the lead analyst from the cybersecurity team at the GIAC Certified Incident Handler in San Francisco, California. So, Alison, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. This morning, I'm going to speak about my experience. I am a task force officer with the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, permanently assigned to a cyber criminal squad in San Francisco, which is an interagency effort, federal, local law enforcement trying to combat cybercrime. So I'm going to speak specifically about the incidents that I've seen here in San Francisco, keeping in mind that we are a very progressive jurisdiction, progressive area near the heart of Silicon Valley. So the scope of my experience is around individuals who may have a greater level of cyber savvy than others across the globe. So I'm really happy to be able to share my experience and hope it might help someone else globally. That's really exciting for me. So the first type of incident is cyber incidents involving minor victims, which is, it's really common. I would say we get 10 to 12 of these incidents a week, whether they are school threats, cyberbullying. My squad handles cyber incidents that local police offices, local sheriff's departments probably don't have the resources to handle. There are still agencies, when they are faced with a cybercrime or a report of a minor victim, they just don't take the case because they have no way to determine the threat actor. They'd have no way to effect an arrest because it's so difficult to try to find these bad guys, to try to find cyber threat actors, either because they're obfuscating their identity or they're located overseas and we just can't reach out and touch them. That's why I work with a joint task force to do that. One of the cases that we have is emailed school threats. Schools are more connected now. They became more connected with the pandemic, and those technologies are actually, they expose the organizations to vulnerabilities, but threat actors can also use them to really infiltrate a network. And schools are in a really poor position to help with investigations. When I show up at a school district asking their IT manager to show me all the Gmail accounts for the students that were affected by an incident, it's challenging to do that. So really training as we go into schools to talk about physical school safety. We can talk about online school safety as well. One of the cases I worked was, it was a girl. I'm trying to focus this on female experience because we don't actually separate victims based on their gender identity, but it certainly affects the way we investigate them. So if you had, it was a female victim, a minor, and her classmates or her friends took naked pictures of her in the school locker room and then posted them to a social share site. And of course, we were working with the parents who didn't want to press charges against the minors, even though they knew who they were. They would rather switch the district of their daughter, so switch her school. And you know, it's always cost benefit. It's going to cost the district more to do that interdistrict transfer, but it's really about shame, because in cybercrime, victims are embarrassed to report. They're still embarrassed to report because maybe they should know better. That's one thing that happens, or it ostracizes them from their friend group and social circles. So that's something that we're really trying to combat, because when folks do report cyber crimes to us, especially women and girls, we want to take that victim-centered approach, and we want to show them that we're going to investigate to the full extent that we can and try to hold the threat actors to bear through cooperation most of the time. Extortion and sextortion. We do know that this is actually a case from the Southern District of California. The indictment was posted end of February, and it was a threat actor who, well, we know that social media users, social media influencers are disproportionately female. And so in this case, it was a male threat actor who was SIM swapping social media influencers, which is essentially taking control of their cell phones and using that to extort them and sextort them by getting them to post incriminating information and then threatening to release it. And that it was a coordinated effort against multiple female social media influencers. The next one, I think someone mentioned pig butcher. Isabel may have mentioned pig butchering. It's essentially a romance scam combined with an investment scam that targets lonely people. And during the pandemic, you would think that it's mostly male, but it's not. It doesn't really show a discrimination for who it attracts. And those incidents are actually cryptocurrency incidents. So we would follow the money, and we follow the money internationally, which is really fun and great. But it exposed a human trafficking nexus in Southeast Asia. We have agents actually overseas right now working these cases where during the pandemic, tourism kind of dried up in many spots around the globe. And so you had individuals who might have formerly been involved with the tourism industry being conscripted or essentially trafficked into call centers that affect these pig butchering scams. So they provide the customer service behind folks who are wanting to fraudulently invest their money. So a huge criminal enterprise. We have a campaign out here. It's called Educate, Seize, Disrupt, where we spread the word about pig butchering, and we try to demystify and remove the shame in reporting those incidents. Of course, people are embarrassed, but the only chance that we have to take down these cyber criminal enterprises is getting multiple reports and encouraging that. What else? Human trafficking. This is my last example. It's a really interesting case. It was a male in a girl's family. So she was an adult at a university in the Bay Area, so very progressive jurisdiction. And her father reported that she was being he wanted to report her as a missing person. And so we investigated that. It turned out she had been working with an organization that is a legitimate organization, we found out, to obtain a new identity, to obtain new papers, documentation, to flee the country because she was fleeing an arranged marriage. It got super messy because the father wanted to report her as a missing person. He wanted to bring her back, and we were investigating it as potential human trafficking, because if you see someone who's being issued a new social security number, new travel documents, you might think someone's trying to take her out of the country and traffic her. But in this case, it was a legitimate business in the Bay Area whose sole purpose is to provide women with this opportunity to escape arranged marriage, which to me was really transformative, something that I would not expect to see in our area. And again, it shows the importance of a victim-centered approach, where we're trying to speak with all parties and we're valuing all perspectives in a criminal investigation. And finally, I do want to say that the international cooperation does hit home. It does hit us, where we hear about organized criminal takedowns of cyber enterprises overseas. The most recent of which would be Hive ransomware. End of January, it was coordinated law enforcement action. Romania, Lithuania, Europol, Norway, all of the countries, and they were able to take down some infrastructure that was used to disseminate disseminate ransomware. And so when we think, wait, we have reports of those incidents in our area, and there's action being taken, that encourages reporting. It encourages people to be involved with law enforcement. In our area, we do have more coordination with private sector companies because they know that cyber crimes are going to impact them eventually. They're going to be a victim if they're not already. So that's kind of a carrot that we have to get involved if we need due process on a private company. So I'm really fascinated by this discussion. I'm not allowed to really break out my cases based on gender, but those are just the ones that come to mind. Another one that's pretty common is social media exploitation. We had a Snapchat incident of solicitation where we picked up, this is actually not far from my home, we picked up a young girl in the middle of the night who had met an individual on Snapchat and was meeting them in person for the first time by the beach. So just really lucky in a lot of cases that folks are becoming more willing to report these incidents in a timely manner, so that we can get whoever we can before something bad happens. So I'm excited when we have small victories like that. So thank you, Anna. Thank you all for hearing my perspective today.
Thank you very much, Alison. Really, it's great to know that there are people with your energy and enthusiasm dealing with these things. So really, thank you very much for sharing some experiences that I'm sure that many of our participants can relate to these type of cases, and these are the major concerns that they may have. So maybe you can take a look at one of the questions that we have already received and see if you feel like addressing it. So we will now move to our next speaker, who is Linda Witong from SOAR Optimist International and a member of the board of the Alliance as well. Linda is a former prosecutor, member of the CSW67 advocacy research group for the Committee on Status of Women New York. And of course, as I said, her participation here in wearing this double hat as the Women Committee and the Alliance is going to illuminate us on a series of issues. Linda, would you like to share your PowerPoint directly, or shall we do it from the host?
I would do it from the host, if you don't mind.
Okay, so you have the floor, and we ask Tobias to share.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. The PowerPoint that I'm about to present, if you need citations for anything that I'm saying, they will be cheerfully provided. I didn't have that much room in my screen to put the citations on everything I'm saying. Next panel, please. Thank you. According to the 2023 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, cybercrime and cyber insecurity are the new entrants in the top 10 rankings of the most severe risks over the next decade. So they have the dubious honor of being the top 10 or among the top 10 global risks. Digital inequality is now being listed by the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report as being one of the top threats. Unfortunately, malicious activity is growing. Rapid digitalization is exposing women and girls to more and intense cyber vulnerabilities as new technologies and criminals create new and inventive ways to prey on women or girls. Next slide, please. Malware has increased by 358%, and ransomware has increased by 435%. Women and men and the governments are simply being outpaced in their ability to effectively prevent or respond to them. Thanks to Allison and her group and Isabella, we're changing that. Next slide, please. 2021 was a banner year for ransomware busts. The cyber criminals are shifting targets because of that, going and focusing to Europe and Asia. So the volumes, even though they are extremely high, are falling in North America, but they're rising as much as 83% in Europe and 39% in Asia. Next slide, please. Now, how would this apply to women? Assuming a woman is in a business, for example, or has an NGO or some other entity that they're involved in, they may become a victim of what we call pay, protect, or perish, which is where a criminal actor tries to force them to pay a high ransom or suffer reputational, financial, regulatory, or legal consequences of the cyber attacks, either personally or their business, or believe it or not, NGOs have been victims of this as well. They are even now branching out to offer a service by cyber mercenaries to help execute attacks on women and men's businesses, or again, other group and entities. And the nightmare, unfortunately, doesn't end perhaps with one request for ransomware. It can include double extortion tactics. In 2022, according to one report, there was a 120% spike in the number of victims that faced subsequent ransom requests. And then we have wiper malware versus ransomware. And I kind of scratched my head when I first saw wiper malware. For those who may not know what that means, it's basically where your criminal actor is going into your files and they're rendering them totally unusable unless there's a ransom paid. That is normally what we would say with ransomware. But when you're wiping it, you're just rendering the data to be totally unusable, period. And for example, Ukraine has been one of the victims of that in the past. Next slide, please. The other trend in 2023 is that critical infrastructure is among the top risks regarding cyber crimes that are focusing on them. And they can involve both resources and services. So if I'm a woman or a girl, my agriculture business, the water that I need to furnish it, my financial systems, public security, transport, energy, domestic infrastructure that connects Wi-Fi, for example, can all be affected by this type of ransomware. And the sad thing is that it's not only the ransomware, but the ruthlessness of some of these criminals is who they're attacking. Despite promising that they weren't going to attack hospitals or healthcare facilities, guess what? The ransomware attacks on those grew 8% over the year with catastrophic effects. Next slide, please. Ransomware in education. Now, this perhaps our educators in our audience may know about, but I didn't. There is a 275% spike in attacks on education. And I'm going, why is that? Because schools don't necessarily have the money to pay large ransoms, but unfortunately, they may have no choice because there's a great deal of data in their system, and criminals have been opening credit cards or selling the data for a very high price in the dark web. And there's been a massive increase in K-12 institutions and primary schools. That rose like 827%. I give an example of the Los Angeles United School District because there they refused to pay the ransom demand, and the criminals published 500 gigabytes of stolen data with social security numbers, bank account information, W-9 forms, and sensitive student health information. Next slide, please. Infrastructure for governments. You may recall, if you were reading the news, that Costa Rica got hit by a ransomware request in April of 2022. The country even declared a national emergency about that. Unfortunately, refusing to pay meant that their import and export logistics were collapsed, and it endangered scores of perishable items. Once again, if you're in that type of business through Costa Rica as a woman or helping your family as a girl, this could be devastating for your lifestyle and for your family. Another attack on a high-profile target dealt with Ireland's health services. They were demanding ransoms in the millions of dollars. Next slide, please. Healthcare saw a jump of 35%, but it was small compared to what customers in education were dealing with regarding malware attacks. Education, once again, leading the pack, rose 411%. Attacks on governments actually were spiking to 887%, but education is part of the government, so you have to assume that in the data there. IoT malware jumped 87%. This is malware that can once launched, it can deny service. It can install and run cryptojacking malware. It can do attacks to deploy ransomware at some later date, or steal data, or send spam emails. In the US, we typically see the most attacks. That rose 169%. The UK had the second highest attack, which increased 163%. And education, once more, not to be forgotten, was 146%. Next slide, please. There are some other malware targets. For the first time, malware rose over 2% with 5.5 billion attacks. And again, it appears that Europe is the new cybercrime hotspot. I'm sorry for all my European colleagues, but that does seem to be the case at this point. And it also seems to be the case that the majority of the top 10 in that list are now in Europe countries or European countries. Retail and finance rose 50 to 86% with malware. So if you were having a retail store as a woman or as a customer, you would see a lot more malware threats than you had before. And again, education, not to be outdone, jumped to 157%, and the K-12 institutions skyrocketed to 323%. Next slide, please. the PDF and Office files, you might not think that the PDF and Office files that you're using in your work, or for the women and girls that are doing education or research like some of us are dangerous, but actually they can be some of the most dangerous malicious file types. But PDF and Office are trying to successfully fight that stigma, and the dubious honor now belongs to .exe files as far as being some of the most dangerous malicious file types that we can face. Intrusions, this is where you gain access to a computer system to steal or damage data or control its resources. In 2022, there was 6.3 hits on that, with a 19% increase. Next slide, please. Finally, phishing. Yes, they're not sending fewer emails, they're just sending different ones. And the criminals are just, if anything, creative. So in 2022, when we had the finance and mortgage related problems, guess what? Phishing regarding that issue went up. In February, when we had fears of recession and homeowners were finding themselves caught between increased interest rates or low housing supply or still rising home prices, guess what? Phishing went and focused on that. And now we're seeing a similar spike in health-related emails, coinciding with open enrollment for many insurance programs and the warning of check one of the above or all: flu, RSV, or COVID-19, what we call triple-demic. Next slide, please. Other trends. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting as far as creativity. The first trends we're seeing are malicious apps that masquerade as legitimate. So you have to be so careful these days when you have someone offering to, send you an application or enlist an application by what you think is a credible company or organization. I would strongly recommend, and I think Allison would agree with me, that when you get some sort of request like that, if you're interested, go to the actual site of the company. Don't respond to these requests, because many of them now are fake. The other thing that's scary, and it's been described as the monster that is already on the loose, is that we are now seeing realistic audios of any person's voice, any person. And they can upload it in a few minutes by audio samples. They can type it in any text for it to say. And now you may get a call from someone who you think is your relative, and maybe, or it may not be. I don't know that the science is exactly that good yet, but it is good enough that both President Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were recently on a auto sample clip where they were theoretically giving a speech that attacked transgender people. And it had over hundreds of thousands hits before it was taken down on social media. But this just is an example of how far and how creative the criminal element can be. That concludes my presentation. And if there are any questions or you need any sites, I'd be delighted to furnish them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. This is fascinating, and I myself, I would have quite a lot of questions for you. So we have heard about some trends, also in terms of getting better knowledge of these issues and their dimensions and how spread they are in all continents. We have some time now for questions and answers. We have already received some questions. I think we have one that has already been answered in the Q&A. One that is open. We have received one question from Wova. I don't know if there is anyone who wants to ask questions. Perhaps Tobias can tell us if participants can speak or should only write down. Tobias.
In writing is always easier, so you can just use the Q&A function.
I
you
could
share-
hardly hear you, Toby. What did you say?
Okay.
Sorry.
So in writing is always easier if you could just use the Q&A function, because then we can also save the questions for later. Plus, I see Linda is already responding to a question in the Q&A function. And we have shared 2 questions during the presentations.
Okay. Very good. So, who wants to start? We have, for example, the question that we received from the platform. I can read it out. It is, I hope to learn red flags, things to watch for as a woman when creating a cybersecurity protocol. Who wants to get the ball rolling?
Well, I'm happy to maybe take from a cybercrime policy and maybe strategy level. And then I could maybe defer to Alison and Linda for their expertise on this as well. But I think, as I mentioned, a lot of what my team is doing is surrounding debunking common myths when it comes to gender mainstreaming cyber policies. And I think a lot of this is dealing with red flags. I hope that this is the right interpretation of the question, and I'm not sure if the attendee is here, so you can always let me know in the Q&A if I've misinterpreted this. But I think when looking at policies and looking at strategies, a key red flag is when gender issues, and I mentioned this before, are synonymized with women's issues. So if a strategy is claiming to be integrating a gendered lens and gender mainstreaming across all of its different provisions, but it only speaks about the issues that women and girls face and doesn't gender disaggregate its approach, to me, that's a red flag. I mean, we can go into why, but I think that was answered very, very well by Linda and Alison in some of their more specific examples. To put it simply, different genders experience different risks from cybercrime, and a strategy that says, oh yeah, we're going to be adopting a gender approach, but then only focuses on harms and risks and vulnerabilities faced by women and girls is not seeing the full picture. Linda or Alison, maybe I can hand over to you to provide some kind of working level examples of this. Sorry, just through
Alison, go for it.
Alison.
The ways that women and girls experience cybercrime, I think, has to do with perception and the gender norms that they've already internalized in their daily life. For example, it's that shame. There was a case where it's extortion of an individual, of a minor victim, and they don't want to report it to their parents because it exposes them to vulnerability that a male victim, a non-binary victim, might experience in a different way. That's my perspective.
Linda, do you have anything to add?
I'm not quite sure what they mean by cyber protocol. If they're talking about the treaty, then I think Isabella has answered it. And if they're talking about law enforcement,
I think you can also go more broader, also at the domestic level, also to see something that is specifically touching the
And what I would add to that is we are blessed with Alison and her group because they have all the latest tools to deal with this and have tremendous support from their community. But I think in terms of security protocol, one of the things that really just jumped out at me was that many of the states and local and regional areas don't have the money or the capacity to deal with all of this type of cybercrime. And we need to give them the training, the education, the exchange of information, and an international, I think it's in this case, it's going to take an international village to enable them to actually really give a woman or a girl the governance and the protection that she needs.
Thank you very much. I I see that maybe Inge, would you like to add something from your point of view to the overall issue? Because here we have a question in the Q&A that can be a follow-up to this topic. The question is, how can gender be taken into account in international cybercrime policy making? How can gender concerns translate into specific policies? And this is, okay, we are talking now international cybercrime, but we have many international policies that really need. So maybe, Inge, if you have it goes back to the why we are organizing this event.
Thank you, Anna, for giving me the floor. This is a very critical topic, as there are so many different interpretations about gender, and the gender, as Isabella already said, if you are only focusing on women and vulnerable groups, it's not the gender perspective. And this is a bit the problem in the definitions in this new convention up to now, as Isabella said. So, yeah, we have to work on that in the framework of how we should see gender in the mindset. So it's still rooted in patriarchy, how we perceive women and girls and men, and gender is a new dimension which is not in the mainstream at the moment. At least in many of these conventions we have now, it is not really translated and transformed. CEDAW Convention is the best practice, and the Istanbul Convention, where these topics are already more deeply, how should I say, affected. Yes.
Yeah. No, indeed. I think that this is the point also in our areas in crime prevention and criminal justice, and I also worked in disarmament. And the language is frequently a bit primitive, so it really needs to take into account the advancement, the knowledge on gender issues that some of the drafters may not have. So I don't know, does anyone know if there is anything like guidelines for drafters on gender issues?
I mean, I think that at the national and in kind of a sectoral level, there are a wealth of really, really valuable toolkits for gender mainstreaming. But I think I have yet to see a step-by-step guide of how to gender mainstream an international convention negotiation process, unless I've been missing something. But I think that this speaks to how we understand key lessons from other processes. At the same time, formal guidelines and help, inheriting all of these lessons from previous, processes, from previous negotiations are really, really critical. But at the same time, I think informal learning as well in these venues has a really, really important role. And I think this is a space that multi-stakeholders and initiatives like this fill really, really well. Informal conversations and continued dialogue about how our expectations and the reality of gender mainstreaming is shifting. For example, gender mainstreaming will look very different in a disarmament context to a cybercrime context, but there are so many lessons and experiences that we can inherit from, for example, one process to another, best practices, what not to do. And I think my point is that these can be inherited formally, of course, through formal guidelines, but of course, informally through conversations like these as well.
Indeed, but maybe we have an idea to develop some minimum guidelines for drafters. Okay, no, thank you. We have more questions in the Q&A. They get a bit more technical, so I will read them out. And let's see who feels like responding. We have from Sophia Mono is asking, I'm considering doing research into Web3 technologies and gender equal policies and policing online. What advice would you give for research topics in this area that would help in the field policy making? Who feels like responding? Linda?
I nominate Allison, actually. I think policing online is the phrase that got my immediate attention.
When I see policing online, I don't call it that. I call it monitoring. But I think the answer would be in reporting, trying to find what data you can that has been reported about ongoing incidents or current incidents, and changing tactics. Let's see. I mean, we're talking about Web3, the metaverse, AI. What about like impersonation? I think that's what we're going to see more of. And like Linda was talking about, the fraudulent content brought about by spoofing, or what is it? When you're like fake video, AI.
Sophie is asking for advice for research topics. So what would you suggest? Maybe Isabella, who is in the...
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm really keen to jump in on this because, again, I feel like I've spent this entire panel being like, oh, check out the work of my colleagues. But one of my colleagues, one of our Academy Fellows, Sarusha Govinder, is actually doing some really interesting research into gender representation in the metaverse. And she's looking at the ways in which, you know, women and people of diverse gender identities represent themselves in metaverse settings in order to protect their safety and kind of safeguard what they want to do and what they want to say. And so I think this really gets into an interesting point of the politics of representation. So understanding the steps that people take in the metaverse to make themselves feel safer and appear kind of more secure. This isn't my area whatsoever, so this is just me regurgitating some of her research, but I'm not sure whether I could maybe grab, Sophie, your email address, and I'm happy to connect you two further because, as I mentioned, my colleague just has a fountain of different ideas in this space.
I also, if I may, I also think that in doing the research, to know what people are monitoring, you need to know, well, what crimes are out there and what are trending or new crimes to determine, you know, how it's going to be monitored. So I think we could all be excellent resources on that, is what we have seen as past crimes, current crimes, and trending crimes, and how we are determining to meet that challenge both in the past, currently, and definitely in the future. So, yeah.
Excellent. I have a question for Linda myself about the statistics that you were showing us. So is there any reflection on the changes in awareness and reporting? So is there any analysis whether the changes practically, if the context in which these reports are made is always the same, or there is progressively increased awareness that makes more reporting possible? Do you know if there is any information?
I'll give you my opinion, and then I'll advise that Allison can give her opinion about that, plus all the new trends, what's happening and how those are being reported as far as her jurisdiction goes. Yes, I think, especially when it comes to money and ransomware, I think the recording is as high as usually as high as the numbers that are actually being committed, because, you know, no one wants to part with money. No one wants their reputation to be damaged, or their group or their organization to be damaged. So yes, I think there is an increase in reporting. However, when you're getting to some of the states where they may not have a good statistical database, or they may not have the capacity to know what issues or questions to ask, or how to investigate it, I think you can get to have a little bit more of a bumpy ride as far as the reporting. But yes, absolutely, the awareness has increased. Allison?
So I think it's telling that most of Linda's sources are actually from private companies who have way better visibility into the types of threats, because they're the private sector companies are the ones deploying all these solutions and monitoring tools on networks, on systems. And so they're getting really good data. I mean, it's pretty disparate. Like for phishing, you might have one vendor. For ransomware, you're going to have another couple of vendors. And so it's messy. But like, there's no centralized database that's accessible for reporting, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. Because of course, if we want a victim-centered approach, we should also know who is there and who feels victimized, because there are some people who may still feel ashamed to report, or they may not know where to go. And of course, today we had our speakers coming from areas that are say doing well from this point of view. We have parts of the world where these things lag behind, so it may be complicated to know exactly where to go to report these things. Let's go back to our Q&A. Just a second. There is, yes, because there is one that is connected to the victim. I just read the question and give the floor to you all to address this. It's from Isabel. We have spoken quite a lot about the victims of cybercrime, but do we know who is committing the crimes and the motivations behind committing the crimes? Is it always as simple as for money? So back to the panel.
I'm happy to take a first stab at this one. In parallel to the UN ad hoc committee negotiation process that I mentioned back in January, we actually ran a track 1.5 event, so bringing together policymakers and civil society to talk about how to mainstream a victim-centric perspective across the Cybercrime Convention and cybercrime policymaking more generally. And a key takeaway here was looking at trends, not only in victimization, but in who the perpetrators were. And you really got to a key point in your question. A lot of the time, there is a predominant opinion that most cybercrime is committed for financial gain and for financial benefits. And across the consolidated negotiating draft, a lot of this language reflected this assumption. For example, with sextortion and the non-consensual sharing of intimate images online, having a disproportionate focus on the financial motivations of perpetrators overlooks a whole variety of different reasons why victims might be targeted, for example, for, just pure intimidation, humiliation, to cause them shame, to make them feel victimized in other ways. So yeah, really important question there. In terms of who's perpetrating these cybercrimes, I think I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleagues, Alison and Linda, to give us a better sense. But yeah, no, really important to mention the non-financial benefit motivation.
I would just quickly interject. No, there are certain crimes. For example, cyberbullying is a huge crime, and many victims, adult or children, are afraid to report it or ashamed to report it. But it definitely is something that has all sort of motivations besides money. Unfortunately, most of the criminals out there are really trying to make a profit one way or the other. And so that is why economics is one of the, I would say, definitely key motivations. But no, when you're talking about cyber stalking, you're talking about cyberbullying, you're talking about sexual or gender related crimes that are being committed online. No, there's motivations beyond money. I would also say that as far as suspects, it depends on the types of crimes that you're talking about. Most of the crimes predominantly are being, at least that I'm seeing, are being committed by men, with the exception of cyberbullying. Unfortunately, a lot of women and girls are involved in that. But Allison, you're an expert, so I'll defer to you too about these trends and motives.
The first thing that came to mind for motivation for me was insiders. So I have a case where it's a former couple, and one partner got in touch saying that their former partner was like planted malicious code into an enterprise product, like into a private sector product. They used to work at the same company. So it gets into sexual harassment, it gets into unwanted sexual advances. And of course, it depends on your level of technical savvy. And I think that's where I'd love to see Isabella debunk this myth where you have it's males who typically have that cyber savvy, who have the technological capabilities to initiate more complex cyber attacks. I don't think that's always true, but in terms of theft of intellectual property, state-sponsored attacks, that sort of thing. But that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that would be really interesting to dig into, you know, recognizing, the gender differences in skills and, you know, the lack of almost opportunities available for women around the world to like upskill in tech. But then of course this has a crime angle. And so, that's definitely, I mean, unfortunately, and so that's definitely an area for future research. I'll be making a mental note of that.
And actually, I would encourage both of you to make a mental note of that, because what I have seen is that time and time again, the women at this point really have a strong gender digital gap. They are not able to be educated with the skills and the training to perhaps be as good as men and boys are on the computer, but it's through no fault of theirs. It can even start very early when the customs and norms are saying, no, women and girls, we're going to give the computer to the guy or the boy. We're going to give them the training. We're going to give them the education. I agree with Isabella and Allison. If the women and girls get educated and adequately trained, you know, I'm sure that there's going to be masters as far as, or mistresses, maybe I should say, as far as computer cybercrime. But yeah, researchers, go for it.
If I could, oh, sorry, Anna. I can hand it
Isabella, maybe you can take the floor and also answer my question. Is there any, not very familiar now with the current draft of the convention. Is there anything on education in the convention? Can you tell us?
Definitely. So there isn't anything on education in particular, but there are two chapters in the future convention which I think are indirectly relevant. The first one is on preventative measures and the second one is on technical assistance. So technical assistance as chapter will basically include a bunch of different provisions that demonstrate how to build, for example, like national, local law enforcement capacity to combat cybercrimes to a sufficient level. And I think there's a huge education and capacity building element into here. From a gender mainstreaming perspective, this is a unique opportunity because if member states agree to a baseline of technical assistance provided to all states party to this convention, there's an opportunity to mainstream gender approaches when upskilling and reskilling, for example, local police who deal with a disproportionate number of romance scams. In the preventative measures chapter, there's also kind of this education angle, which I think will be interesting to see as states gear up for the 5th negotiating session in April. Preventative measures are everything from, as you mentioned, maybe public awareness programs and, you know, education in schools to closing the digital divide and making sure people are more aware of the risks inherent in going online and, you know, the risks inherent in cyberspace, to put it in very, very broad terms. So yeah, definitely education will be one to watch ahead of the 5th negotiating session. So watch this space. And then just to, on the point made earlier, building on what Linda and Alison said, I think that understanding these differential impacts of cybercrime on different genders really just underlines the importance of being intersectional in our approach. You know, recognizing that it's not enough to talk about gender. We need to talk about race, ethnicity, educational backgrounds, sexuality, you know, the level of access you have to ICTs as well, because this not only helps us build a better understanding of the cyber threat landscapes, but it also helps us better understand how to craft policies and responses to the specific needs, priorities, and experiences of victims themselves. So yeah, always a fan of the intersectional approach, but I think it's really demonstrates its value across many of the examples that Linda and Alison have been sharing today.
You can't have a success without having an intersectional approach, because right now we have maybe up to 50% of women and girls in our population that many of them may not have the adequate training and education, and many of them have what we call intersectional discrimination. They're not only discriminated because they're a woman, but because they're either their race, their preference, their minority as far as indigenous or other types of groups that are unfairly discriminated against.
Thank you very much. I don't know if our participants have any other questions they would like to ask. If not, I would like to give you the floor just for 1 minute for a takeaway message. So something that we can reflect on in the coming months, maybe witnessing what is going on with the negotiations and trying to monitor if the progress is good or not. So please, who wants to start?
I'll start. I would say that don't forget about older women in this picture, because older women very often are not educated. They don't have the skills and training. They may even be illiterate, and they are in need desperately of the services and other infrastructure that can be provided. So let's not forget older women in all of this equation. Talk about intersectional discrimination. Yeah.
Alison or Isabella?
Sure. So
Alison.
I'll go. Isabella has the holistic picture. So for me, I spend a lot of time increasing awareness based on the types of incidents that I see and that I respond to. And so we use that information we're always looking for money. We're looking for funding to improve more awareness, to get more technology. But I love the idea of a policy that it operationalizes all of these learnings that we have. And it would be something to refer to really drive progress for us. So that's exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabella?
Yeah, I think just as a final remark to wrap things up, and I think I said this before, it's really about time to mainstream gender in cyber policy. It is a cyber policy issue that is gender equality, and it is an international security issue. And even though, as I mentioned, for this panel, for attendees, of course, we understand the value of gender mainstreaming, I think still a lot of important work has to be done in fighting cybercrime, in addressing cybersecurity threats, to prove the value, the operational value of a gender and inclusive approach, as opposed to having gender as some kind of marginalized lens that gets thrown in, and at the end, building it first and building a policy around a strong gender and human rights core, particularly in the context of the International Cybercrime Convention, but in other cases as well, is really a strategic priority, as I mentioned before. I mean, integrating gender considerations in cyber policy makes for better policies. And at the end of the day, what we're pushing for are policies that can help all genders and all people maximize the benefits that cyberspace has to offer. It's really as simple as that.
Thank you very, very much. Inge, would you like to say some closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting panel. We all learned a lot. I was part of the ad hoc session meetings, and I know how difficult it is to follow this and to understand this process here. And I do hope that our participants got some insight in the work we are doing here in Vienna. And thanks to the panelists to clarify or to open the myth about all these cybercrime things here in Vienna. Thank you very much. And Anna, thank you very much for guiding and moderating this event.
Thank you. No, thank you. Really, I've learned a lot.
Yes, me too.
And I'm really grateful to the panelists for their sharing, for their clarity. So I think that we also got very good feedback from the participants who were very pleased with your extensive responses to their questions. So thank you very much for this. I think that we, as I said at the beginning, we have the recording of this event, so we will make it available on our YouTube channel, so it will be available on the website of the Alliance, and the link can, of course, be disseminated further around. Tobias, yes, please step in.
Yes. And we will also share Linda's PowerPoint presentation on our website. I think that's the easiest way to share it, because we got one email address, but you can find on our website the same link as the event was. You will find not only the recording, but also the presentation from Linda, and vice versa. I will, under the YouTube video, so if you only find the YouTube recording, link to our website, so the circle closes.
And if I might add, if you need any sites for any particular statistic, I can give you that.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, because access to resources is always very important. And with this, I would like to thank our panelists, to thank the participants, and to thank Tobias for supporting us with this event. And wish you all a nice day, afternoon, whatever, and a good continuation of the discussions at the CSW. Thank you.
Thank you all.